I was wondering what your family upbringing was like.
My father's a career Air Force non-commissioned officer and retired as a Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank in the U.S. Air Force. I lived on Air Force bases my entire life. So it's a military family, a military upbringing. We traveled all around the world. I lived in New Zealand. I lived in Japan. I lived on a bunch of Air Force bases in the Midwest. I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I went to school at Patrick Air Force Base and Satellite Beach for a while, and eventually at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where I was in high school. So I would say fairly straightforward Air Force family, Air Force brat, they would say. Then I got an Air Force scholarship, and I went to MIT on an Air Force scholarship, and I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. I ended up serving the Air Force Reserve, and I ended up as a captain in the Air Force Reserve. And so I would say a lot of my upbringing had that Air Force root in it.
Does that Air Force upbringing also talk about or touch upon, I don't know, some thrill-seeking element, some adrenaline rush in your attraction to Bitcoin and the ups and downs of volatility associated with it?
I think that the Air Force elevates and idealizes the engineer, right? I mean, the Air Force is all about engineered aircraft and technology. So technology is a pretty important principle in the Air Force. And I think it gave me a lot of appreciation for flight, for engineering, for aerospace design, for spaceships. And that's why when I went to MIT, I studied aerospace engineering and spaceship design. And so that gave me an appreciation for systems engineering. And in systems engineering, you study higher order systems, feedback systems, servo mechanisms, cybernetic systems, and obviously mechanical engineering, civil engineering, all sorts of engineerings, electrical engineering. And so when I finally discovered Bitcoin, I think I appreciated it as an engineered system, right? It's full of really, really powerful, elegant engineering structures that made it stable, right? Something like the difficulty adjustment is a first order negative feedback loop, a servo mechanism. It's the same principle you need to make a steam engine work, by the way. It's the same principle that pops up in all sorts of machines. It's a principle in electrical engineering, and it's a principle in all kind of nonlinear dynamic simulations. You need a first order feedback loop. But then the other thing I realized is Bitcoin is thermodynamically sound money, and it's a thermodynamically sound network. The idea of thermodynamically sound is very important to an aeronautical engineer, because in order to create airplanes, you normally do all the modeling and engineering based upon assumptions of adiabatic systems. And an adiabatic system is a sealed closed system, and in a sealed closed system where energy doesn't leave or enter the system, you can solve all the problems. And so they say assume an adiabatic system, and it turns out that if the system is not adiabatic, if it's not sound and sealed, you can't solve any problem. And so the real genius of Satoshi was to create a thermodynamically sound monetary system. And if I give you the example, I give you a bathtub, there's a leak in it, or I give you a ship, there's a leak in it, or if I give you a plane and there's a hole in the fuselage, you know that, like, that's always the theme of the horror movies, the Titanic, or the window got blown out in the airplane, explosive decompression. All of the catastrophes are because you don't have an adiabatic system or thermodynamically sound system. The economic catastrophe, that's the analogy here, is hyperinflation, or the collapse of a currency. And so all of my engineering background at MIT was how to design systems that are sound, that work, a ship that flies, and a ship that doesn't, a plane that flies, a ship that doesn't sink, right? You see them in my house when you see the ships that don't sink, the planes that fly, right? Satoshi was a truly genius engineer, but you could also say Satoshi was simply a competent engineer. Satoshi designed a monetary system using semiconductors, public-private key cryptography, and the internet that was possible for the first time sometime around 2009. It was impossible during the time period of Hayek or von Mises when all the Austrian economists wrote about this. They didn't have the technology to design a thermodynamically sound monetary system. So they used gold, which was an imperfect network and an imperfect asset. It's kind of like Da Vinci and Michelangelo, or maybe Newton, and Leibniz. They're genius scientists and they want to design an airship. But if you don't have an internal combustion engine and petroleum, you can't make an airplane. The Wright brothers had petroleum and a motor, an internal combustion engine, and they could create an airplane. Maybe not so theoretically genius, but practically they made us fly. So Satoshi took all of the math, all of the engineering, all of the monetary theory that came in the hundreds of years or thousands of years before him or her, and created perfect money. And so I think my background, drove me to go to MIT. My education was as an engineer and as a systems engineer. By the way, there's another important point. Aeronautical engineers are probably the greatest of all systems engineers, because to create an airplane, you have to master civil engineering, mechanical engineering, metallurgy. You have to master electrical engineering, stability. And if you get anything wrong, the plane crashes and burns. And you can't, for example, you have to build an airplane with aluminum, even though the best material is steel, because steel is so heavy, the plane crashes. You can never fly a steel plane. And so you have to make a compromise. And the compromise is, I have a plane that flies, but it's not as strong as steel. When you're a civil engineer, you use steel, but the building doesn't fly. So if you apply that to money and Bitcoin was an engineered system with compromises. Like, well, why can't you just clear the transactions every 5 seconds? Well, because it's not stable, right? If you want it to be stable, then you have to clear the transactions every 10 minutes. And so, well, why can't you just have infinite block space? Well, because then it's not stable over time and the security collapses. Well, Satoshi understood that if you wanted it to be stable in time and space, there was a limit to what you could achieve. Just like, well, why can't I just have a 100-story building that flies across the ocean? Well, a civil engineer wouldn't know why you can't, but an aeronautical engineer would be able to explain exactly why you can't fly a 100-story building across the ocean, right? And so my background, I think, caused me to look at Bitcoin and appreciate the beauty of the engineering. And whereas someone that doesn't have an engineering background might say, well, I'm just going to hack together something which is smarter, faster, quicker, and easier, and you end up with all the other altcoin experiments. But what they don't do is they don't appreciate the thermodynamic, physical, mathematical, and systems limitations over time and space that a really good systems engineer would understand. And so I think that all brought me to where I am today, and it caused me to look at this thing and say, oh my, Satoshi created the perfect monetary network, for the world. And it's like someone gives you steel, you want to build Manhattan. Someone gives you aluminum, you want to build an Air Force. And so I see Bitcoin and I say, oh, perfect money. What am I going to build? And, so far we've taken our company, with $1 billion market cap and built it into an $80 billion company just by building off of what I view as crypto steel.